Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. As-salatu as-salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my dear brothers and sisters. Alhamdulillah, as we welcome you back to our weekly Friday night Halaqah, and as the theme is for the month of October, as the Ontario government has declared this Islamic History or Islamic Heritage Month, we are going to continue on that topic, inshallah. Today, we are really blessed and honored to have with us Professor Dr. Kathy Bullock. She is a TV host for Sound Vision Muslim Network TV and the Director of Special Programs. She teaches Islamic politics in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto at Mississauga. And she is the president of Compass Books, dedicated to publishing top quality books about Islam and Muslims in English. Her own books include Muslim Women Activists in North America, Speaking for Ourselves, and Rethinking Muslim Women and the Veil, Challenging Historical and Modern Stereotypes, which has been translated into Arabic, French, Malayalam, and Turkish. Her latest research was published by the Yaqeen Institute and is a study of zakat in Canada. She is originally from Australia and currently resides in Oakville, Ontario, Canada, with her husband and children. She has embraced Islam in 1994. Alhamdulillah, she has also taught here a few semesters at the Canadian Centre for Deen Studies, and I had the privilege to also take some courses with her as well. And today she's going to talk about the history of Muslims in Canada. Last week we had with us Ustad Taha Ghayur, and he was going over the impact that Muslims are having today in Canada. We're going to now step back a little bit in the past and see the history of Muslims. So thank you very much for taking the time today, Professor Dr. Kathy. And inshallah, my brothers and sisters, if you have any questions on the topic, write them in the chat, and our goal or intention is that we'll dedicate a few minutes at the end for Q&A. Thank you. I'll pass the mic off to her, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Brother Asim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. All praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and we seek His help and ask His forgiveness. We seek refuge with Allah from the evil of ourselves and the evil results of our actions. I testify that Allah alone is worthy of worship and that Muhammad is His slave and final messenger. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon the last and final messenger, Muhammad, his family and his followers. I'd also like to begin with a land acknowledgement, that this land on which we live and work has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently in the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I always do a land acknowledgement now because Muslims know the ravages of colonialism. We've experienced it, and so I think it's part of our responsibility of being in this place now called Canada to be part of the restorative justice for the Indigenous peoples of Canada who are still suffering the ravages of colonialism. Have you ever heard of the Muslim Alexander Hamilton? What do we really know about the Muslim history of Canada? There hasn't been a very lot written or published about this, but I'm very happy to tell you that I'm going to use as my main source tonight a book that just came out called Minarets on the Horizon, Muslim Pioneers in Canada. This book has made tonight's talk so much easier. And it's a series of interviews with many Muslims who came to Canada, some of them as early as the 1900s. I'm going to tell you 4 stories. And these stories each has a main theme that I believe connects to today, to today's Muslim community and today's society. If you were present amongst me today, I was going to do it like a quiz and see a show of hands who could figure out what the main theme of the story was, but we might have to just leave that to the chat. Let's start with Alexander Hamilton. the Muslim Alexander Hamilton. He was originally Ali Ahmed Asif Abu Shadi from Lala in the Bekaa Valley, now in Lebanon. He arrived in Canada in 1905. The author here, Murray Hogben, interviewed him in 1979 when he was 88 years old and had been in Canada for 75 years. I'm going to read you a little bit of his story because I believe it captures a theme of today's Muslims. This is said in the first person because the author, Murray Hogben, interviewed people and they spoke about themselves. So when I say I, of course I don't mean me. I'm reading the story as recorded, and this is Alexander Hamilton, or Ali Ahmed Asif Abu Shadi, talking. He says, "I left the old country when I was 12 years old in 1905. My uncle, Hussein Abu Shadi, was coming to America along with 14 others. At the time, I was herding cattle about 2 miles out of town, Lala, and we heard about Canada having a lot of gold, the Yukon gold. So I left the cattle with a friend to go and say goodbye to my uncle. And I said, look after them because I won't be long. I went running and running, and when I caught up with him, it was almost a mile, and I asked him if I could go with him to see Beirut. I hadn't seen Beirut, and he said, okay. I heard them talking about Canada and saw the ocean from the top of the mountain in Beirut, and asked if I could come along. He said yes, but I had no passport, clothes or anything. We went to Marseille, and at that time the British government immigrant agents were hard on the Arabs, the Muslims, the Christians too, and the Jews, because we're a business people. They would inspect our eyes and say, nope, good, no good, no good. They picked my uncle, and when they came to me, they said, that's his nephew. So they took 3 of us out of 15 and said, you other boys can go home, because your eyes are no good to go to Canada. The rest were told they could go either to South America or back home. After landing in Montreal, we came to Winnipeg. There were some people there who had been there 4 or 5 years, like Old Man Awid, Mr. Ali Hamden, and Tarabin, and all those people, and they were already in business. Our people are business people, they're not farmers. So anyway, my uncle borrowed money and went out and bought me clothes so I'd be presentable. I started out selling fans that I bought for 60 cents a dozen and sold them for $1.20, 10 cents a piece. We were there for about a month in Winnipeg, and all of a sudden someone said, young man, go west. They weren't saying it to me, but they were saying it to everybody. So we came to Edmonton, and my uncle bought a couple of horses, cayuses we called them, and an old wagon, and I started peddling stock again. We kept going and going until we came to Lac La Biche, me and my uncle, in 1906. At that time, there were only Indians there, except for the Hudson Bay man and his wife. It was an old house, and we rented a small warehouse and built shelves in it to hold our things. At that time, it took 8 days to go back to Edmonton. Some days you could only make 8 or 10 miles a day. I got the name Alexander Hamilton in 1909 because I couldn't spell my name, Ali Ahmed Asif Abu Shadi. They said, how do you spell it? And I said, I don't know. And one of the other fellows said, say Hamilton, then everybody can spell your name. My uncle stayed with me for 3.5 years. He went back home in 1909 with $500. At that time, I was about 16 years old and kept going with the business. We used to close the store in summertime because the Indians had nothing and they lived on fish and other things. So I thought I'd take a homestead at Edam in Saskatchewan, north of Battleford. You had to break 10 acres a year every year for 3 years before they would give you title to the place. Finally, I shipped a carload of wheat to Fort William at 32 cents a bushel, But out of that, I had to pay all the bills, the freight, and everything else. And I said, never mind. I sold the land for $1,000 in 1912, and then I went back to my business again, and my business had grown. When the railroad came in 1916, people bought homesteads for $10 for 160 acres. We had no grain elevator, so I built an elevator. I had a sawmill already. I had the Ford agency later on. I had the International Harvester Agency and about 25 or 30 people working for me outside the store. I was taking a contract from the railroad for making ties for North Alberta Railway. The Hudson Bay had been there for 270 years, but a fire in 1919 burned down the whole town, except for the church, a station, and the hotel on the lakeshore. After the fire, I built a new store, much bigger than I had before, 32 by 130 feet, in 1919. With the Ford agency, an Imperial Oil filling station, I was the largest businessman there at that time. We were also suppliers for a lot of the surrounding country stores. Leaving my stores with a manager called Frank Fisher, I started my floating store business. I had a store on a boat and travelled all the way from Fort McMurray to the Arctic. In 1926, I took 200 head of cattle to Fort Smith and sold them to Bill Mahoney. In 1927, I started a sawmill in Lac La Biche at Moccasin Flats. In 1937, we started a mink ranch with Frank Nashman, another Lebanese, by the slaughterhouse, which I owned. Later, I went on my own and moved my ranch to the site by the lake shore. We bought a quarter section of land there from a man from Slave Lake in the name of Sean Hamilton, which was his oldest son, Sam Asif and Andy Hamden. Now, of course, his story continues, but that encapsulates the theme of his story that I wanted to highlight, and I'll come back to that later on. Alexander Hamilton, or Ali Ahmed Asif Abu Shadeh, died in 1985. Now I'm going to share with you story number 2. Salim Ghanam, born in 1911 in Canada and died in Edmonton in 2003. His father had arrived again from the Bekaa Valley in what is now Lebanon. He was trying to avoid conscription into the Ottoman army. His father was 18 years old and arrived in 1901. He married a young woman who was originally from a Methodist family, but she converted to Islam. And Salim Ghanam was born on a home-built farmhouse in North Saskatchewan. They moved around to many cities and finally settled, when he was younger, in Regina. I'm going to read to you part of his story that was interviewed in 1979. We later moved from Swift Current to another farm in the town of Admiral. One Lebanese peddler came by, and of course, when you go to any home, but a Muslim home particularly, you are welcome, and you are going to have dinner and stay there. He had a buggy with a canopy on it and a lot of merchandise in it. He took his horse and put it in the barn and watered it. Mother was preparing the meal, and all of a sudden he went out to the wagon and took out a little parcel and went by the house out to a stone pile, and he put his parcel in it. Mother said to herself, "Now what is this man doing? What did he put in that stone pile?" Later on, when they were busy talking, curiosity got to her and she went out to look in the stone pile, and she found maybe 6 bottles of beer. She took each bottle nicely and cracked them on the stones. When the peddler went back to get his beer, he found the bottles broken, and he knew who had done it. And he came back and he said, "Chelsea, I'm sorry, but why did you do it?" She said, "Don't ask me why I did it. Why did you do it in the first place?" He felt badly and knew there was no use denying it, because he knew that she knew he had put it there. That was an example of the fact that she was very, very firm. Liquor was absolutely prohibited. All the way through, I can never remember any time liquor or pork products came near the house. Mother was very strict on that. In other words, she accepted Islam. It wasn't a nominal thing with her. She accepted it, studied it, learned it, and practiced it. We didn't say prayers as such. Dad had a bath, which would be once a week on the farm because the water was cold, especially in winter. Every time he had his bath, he would always go to the bedroom and make his prayers, and I used to watch him. I was a little guy, you see. At no time were we taught what to do. In the early days, around 1914 or 1915, these prairie fires developed, and they would range over vast areas, covering 10 or 15 miles. In one particular incident, a prairie fire was coming, and there was the Kazil farm and then our farm. Dad saw the smoke coming, and the farmers were hitching up their breaker plows to make 4 or 5 furrows to break the spread of the fire. Everyone was very concerned, and a Norwegian neighbor to the south of the Kazils came over and said to Dad, "What's the matter? Everybody is fighting the fire, and you're not fighting the fire. You're not preparing for it." "No problem," Dad said. He was not concerned at all. The fire was within range then, and he went up on a little haystack and offered his prayers, and the wind turned and the fire's out. I wasn't old enough to remember the actual fire, but I've been told this by the Kazil family themselves. You see, our family is descended directly from Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gilani, the Persian Sufi saint of the 11th century Baghdad, so we belong to the Qadiriya sect. When I was going to school in those years, the teacher would probably teach 1 year, and the second year there would be a new teacher. In the country, nobody wanted to stay too long. At this particular time, the new teacher came, and she wanted to know all about her students. "Your name and your name," she asked. And when she came to me, I answered, "Salim." "Salim? Oh, that's an odd name. What's your nationality?" "Syrian," I answered. She said, "What's your religion?" At that time, we didn't say Islam, but we said Mohammedan because that was the common term used. I didn't know any better. She didn't ask any of the other students this question. Today, of course, I wouldn't have said Mohammedan. All of a sudden, she looked frightened. She took her hand and drew her finger across her throat and said, "Turk." And as she said that, her face reddened, and the boy who was sitting on one side of me and a girl on the other side both got up and moved their seats and moved away quickly. I often think of that today and the changes that have taken place. At that time, they were so frightened of the Ottoman Empire that anything that referred to the Turks was frightening, and they became frightened of me. It took some time before my chums in the school would come back and sit beside me. To them, I was one of those wild Turks that at any moment could draw a scimitar out of my pocket or someplace and slice their throats. What a change it is between now and then. And his story continues, but I'm stopping reading there. During the Great Depression, Salim Ghanam finished grade 10 but could not find a job, so he spent a lot of time in the library reading. He found a little shelf called Literatures of the East, and it was the first time he discovered a book that had a small translation of the Quran in English. First time he'd ever seen the Quran in English. He was very excited, and he studied it, and he studied Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, Judaism, and Mormonism, all of which convinced him of his faith of Islam. In Edmonton he moved, and in 1940 he became the president. He moved to Edmonton in 1940, and later on he became the president and the founding vice chair of the Council of Muslim Communities of Canada. He wrote and published books about Islam. He's the brother to the famous fiddler, Canadian fiddler, whose name is Amin Ghanam, who had a nickname of King Ghanam. And he died in Edmonton in 2003. Later on, we'll come back to his story to see what I think is one of the main themes of his story that resonates with today. And now, our third story. This one is the story of Usman Ali, who was interviewed in 217. He was born in Fiji in 1936, of Indian heritage. His father had been an indentured labourer under the British. There was no university in Fiji, and he was the fourth son in the family, so he had to find something to do. And his friend suggested he go to Canada. He was in the middle of helping build a mosque there, so he said, when I'm done that, I'll go. He got a visa and arrived in 1964 to Vancouver. He was 28 years old. He worked as a mechanic, and he met people who'd never heard of Muslims or Islam. But one day he met someone who told him that there was a Pakistan-Canadian Cultural Association. They'd bought a place and they were allowing Muslims to pray there. So he went. It was a multicultural group he found: Turkish, Bosnian, Egyptian and West Indian praying together. The first Ramadan Taraweeh in January 1965. There was no heating and it was very cold, so people didn't come back. Now, the owners of the building were hosting holiday season events which limited the Muslim group activities. But in April the 1st, 1965, which was a Good Friday holiday, they managed their first Jummah. And now I'm going to read a part of his story because of how I think it resonates with today. And again, I'm reading. When it says I, it's him talking. In the summer of 1965, we were trying to do a lot of things, which included improving the heating to make people happy to come back to this place. We decided to have another meeting to decide how to move forward in a better organized way. But there was a problem brought up by some Pakistani brothers regarding the Qibla, or direction to Mecca. The most important thing we were doing was to find the proper direction from Mecca to Vancouver. They, the Pakistani group, wanted to pray the way they prayed back home. There was nothing wrong with praying in the wrong direction when you don't know, but when you try to do something right, they started stopping it. If you were in Pakistan right now and directed yourself towards Mecca, you were facing southwest, so that's how they wanted to pray here. Another group came along and using a flat map of the world, they were going southeast from Vancouver. We tried to talk to them and said, let's get together and find the proper direction. We went to the University of British Columbia as well, but nobody there cared about these things because we were Muslim and they weren't Muslim. Finally, at the library, I saw a globe and I took a string and found that the shortest route from Vancouver to Mecca was through the north. Although we were not 100% sure, we were very close. So we started praying in the north-northeast direction, and then the trouble started. They knew that we had put in the heating system and everything else without them paying for it. We had collected funds from other people to support this project. It was November, and so we decided we should tell people about our accomplishment and see what they wanted to do. We could not go on like this, but we didn't have anything. The building did not belong to us, and we were not a registered organization. We were just volunteers. It was Sunday, November 20, 1965. It was a very important meeting. The time was 1:30 p.m. There were about 20 of us there, and some people who opposed us were very loud, showing off their authority, saying, "Who are you?" So before the agenda was presented, there were lots of questions. Who authorized this meeting in the Pakistan-Canada Cultural Association building? In fact, there was no brotherly feeling. It was so loud, voices could be heard maybe 30 feet away on the street. MZ Khan wanted to say something, but he was shouted down. Even our treasurer and a secretary were abused and told, "You are white Muslims, white Muslims." Where they got this from, I don't know. I come from Pakistan, I come from here, I come from there. These kinds of words, shouting. The meeting ended before it started, and that was the end of the Islamic Center of Vancouver. Everyone walked away except MZ Khan and myself. We looked at ourselves and said that whatever we did, we didn't want our efforts to go to waste, so we should go on with the good things we had. He took me to his house for a cup of tea and I said, "What do we do?" And we agreed we'd come back next Sunday and see what we could do. Another Ramadan was coming, and what could we do about it? That's the end of the reading portion. In the end of the story, they ended up having a meeting at University of British Columbia at the International House there with 28 people, and they founded in 1966 the British Columbia Muslim Association. A few years later, they were able to buy 4.78 acres of land in Richmond near Vancouver. And now the British Columbia Muslim Association owns 10 mosques in British Columbia. That's the end of story number 3. And now my last story, a story of Hillary Hamden, who was born in 1905 in Lala, Lebanon, came to Canada, and died in Edmonton in 1988. She was interviewed in 1979. The section of the book where she narrates her story is the longest out of all the sections. It actually contains several themes, one of which I'll highlight, but you'll probably catch the rest as I read. And I'm reading her story because it's one of the most complete in terms of narrating what happened to her. Hillary Hamden recalled her life for me, for the author, in 1979. She says, "I was born in Lala, Lebanon in 1905. When I was 17 years old, I married Ali Hamden and emigrated to Fort Chipewyan in northern Canada, on the border of the Northwest Territories and Alberta, about 500 miles north of Edmonton. My husband owned a trading post there and 4 trader boats. He also had a general store and traded mostly with the Indians. They gave him the furs and he gave them groceries and whatever else they needed. My husband Ali left for Canada when he was 17 years old and stayed in Canada for 22 years before returning back to Lebanon in 1922. With my father's permission, we were married that year and left for Canada in 1923 to begin our lives together there. I was 17 at that time, and Ali was 43. At this time, my brother, Ahmed Jomha, had a trading post at Fort Norman, and my brother-in-law, Jim Darwish, had a store and a trading post. My husband had opened a different store in Stony Rapids, which he had someone run for him. My father's cousin also had a post in Black Bay. They were all located in the north. My husband had 2 Métis clerks at his store who served as his Cree interpreters, and through the 2 clerks, Ali learned to speak Cree. For the first 2 years that I was in Fort Chipewyan, I did nothing but cry. I had one daughter, Evelyn, and another, Lavida, born 1 year later. Evelyn was born with a club foot, and I needed to get help for her. So Ali, Evelyn, Lavida, and I went by dog sled from Fort Chipewyan to Fort McMurray. My husband had 2 dog sleds with 2 teams of huskies to pull them, along with 2 Métis drivers. It took us 7 days to travel the 200 miles to Fort Mac. During the trip, we sometimes slept in the snow on Bruce boughs, sometimes in Indian shacks, and I slept in a sleeping bag with my babies beside me. I was pregnant with my 3rd child at the time, and a nun from the Catholic convent told me I could lose my baby. But I said that if it was God's will, it would be, but I must do my duty for this child, meaning Evelyn, and I would accept the will of Allah. At that time, my 2nd child, Lavida, was a year old and on the trip with us. I had to hold her in my arms covered in furs to keep her warm during the cold days and nights. After arriving safely in Fort McMurray, we boarded a train to Edmonton to get Evelyn the help she needed. The mail was very hard to get in Fort Chip because it was so isolated back then. In the fall, all of the supplies we needed for the winter were brought to us by train from Edmonton to Fort Mac, and then by steamer up the Athabasca River to Fort Chip. We never saw anyone from the times things froze up in the winter until spring arrived. The mail was brought to us by horse and sleigh. During my first winter in Fort Chip, the locals told me it was safe to walk on the lake, that even the horses could walk on it. I thought they were joking. The first time they took me onto the lake, I was very frightened and thought we would sink at any moment. We had a thermometer above the store, and one morning when we woke up, it was 69 degrees below 0 in Fahrenheit. There was another day after that when it got so cold our thermometer broke. I felt quite alone for the first couple of years I was in Fort Chip. There was no doctor, no hospital, and I did not know what to do for my daughter Evelyn's club foot. I treated it and massaged it 3 times a day. The nuns from the nearby Catholic convent helped me look after my babies as they were born, and they taught me to speak English and about how to live in the north. They were very good to me, and I was lucky to have them. Times were still tough, but I was one of the lucky ones. I always had a maid and help, and I needed it, as I had all 6 of my children in Fort Chip, the first 5 within a 6-year period. Eventually, I grew more comfortable in Fort Chip, and I had a wonderful time, and I enjoyed our life there. I liked the Indians, and they liked me. We visited some of them, as I did not see them in the store often. I remember once in my first year there, my husband said to me, "I'm going to ask the Indian chief for supper." I said to him, "What am I supposed to cook?" He said, "Whatever you like. They like meat." So I remember when I went out, and he, the chief, was in front of the store. The store wasn't too far from the house, and he looked at me and he said to my husband in Cree, because he didn't speak English, "No, I'm not coming for supper." My husband said, "Why?" He said, "I think your wife is pretty cranky." My husband said, "Why?" And he said, "She has very narrow eyebrows, and that means among the Indians you're not good-natured." But my husband assured them that I was very good-natured and he should come. He did, and we became very good friends. I learned a few Indian words, not too much because I was so busy. This daughter, meaning Evelyn, was 5 years old when my 5th baby was born. So that is 5 babies in 6 years. I was very busy with the house and the children, and my husband had 3 men working for him who used to eat lunch and supper with us. 2 of the men were Métis, and 1 bookkeeper, Mr. Rossicure, who was French. There was a man called Peter Baker who they called the Arctic Arab. His Arab name was Ahmed Farah. He was quite a character. He lived like an Indian and was very popular with them. He ran for Member of Parliament in Fort Resolute and won because all the Indians voted for him. He was called a territorial councillor and represented the Northwest Territories in Ottawa. This would be about 10 years ago, meaning 1964. He is a Shia and came from a town called Labashia in South Lebanon. I stayed in Fort Chip until the children became a little older, about 6, and then my husband said I should go to Edmonton and start them in school. We came here, but unfortunately he had a fire back up north and he really needed me, so I went back with the kids. By that time we had a doctor, Dr. Lewis, who had a family of 4 children. I would later name our 6th child Lewis after Dr. Lewis. There was a policeman with a family of 2 children, Mr. Crawley, the minister, who was the school teacher. When I went back north from Edmonton, I took a private teacher by the name of Mary Hunter back with me. She stayed for about a year or so, and then an unfortunate thing happened in her life there, and she ended up leaving Fort Chip. After that, we came back to Edmonton. But I didn't like to stay here while my husband was up north. So I said I wanted to go back up north and take a young teacher named Helen Bathede with us. The doctor and my husband agreed that we would both pay her, but she didn't stay very long because she didn't get along very well with the local people, and she didn't like the country as there was really nothing for young people to do. I was always very strict about my religion. There was a Catholic mission in Fort Chip, and one of the priests said it was a shame that I should go to the fire of hell because I wasn't Catholic. And he still liked me so much, but he said it was too late for my husband. I asked him if the key to heaven was in the Catholic's hands, and he said to me it was. I told him I was very sorry, and I was brought up in a very strong religious family, and I thought heaven was open to everyone who is good, no matter what religion they are. I could never accept any religion except Islam. The other priest at the mission told me to never mind, he liked me as I was. He said I was a beautiful person and I would go to heaven in spite of everything. I was in Canada for 5 years before I saw a Muslim woman, although I met a lot of Christian women. I heard of a Muslim lady called Mrs. Hader who owned a restaurant. I belonged to several clubs, and when the Second World War broke out, we decided we should form an organization to help the Red Cross, although we still worked for the mosque. It was a wonderful life, but very lonely. I was young when I had my children, and I enjoyed them and I played with them. I loved my children and my husband. Early on, my husband built a schooner which he called Evelyn of the Lake after my first daughter. It was very sturdy and would carry almost anything. We traveled in it up the river from Fort Chip to my husband's other store in Stony Rapids. To go into the North Country, as it was then called, people had to have a pioneer spirit. During our time in Fort Chip, my husband and I came to Edmonton every summer. And in 1937, as I already mentioned, my husband said to me, "You take the children to school." My husband said there was a school there in Chippewa and it wasn't good enough. So we came here to Edmonton. In 1937, there were 22 Arab people here who organized a group and got together and held a meeting to discuss building the mosque. The story continues with a tiny little break, but she starts up this story again about building the mosque. Sheikh Najib had moved to Edmonton from Winnipeg because there wasn't much Islam there and he wanted to build a mosque, but he was alone. I attended the meeting and 3 people wanted a mosque and the rest wanted a hall. I told them if it was a hall they wanted, they could use my house any time for parties. Our home was always open. Our president said we were lost, but I told him, no, God is with us. I spoke up and I told them I was the youngest there and I was so hungry to hear the words of Allah. I told them, we have got to know our religion ourselves, to believe in it and know it, and we have got to teach our children. The motion to build a mosque was carried and passed the second time. The president was not convinced the mosque would be built, but I told him if God wanted us to build a mosque, he would give us a helping hand. I saw the mayor, John Fry, about purchasing a lot for the mosque. There were 2 lots. One was in a poor district, and the other one was $1,100. And all we had in our organization was $50. I convinced the mayor to give us a lot free, and I told him he would be the first mayor to open a Muslim mosque in North America. I traveled all over Alberta and Saskatchewan collecting money, and 2 years we had our mosque paid in full. Before the mosque was to open, we needed to find someone who could explain Islam. We asked a friend of ours, S.B. Shaker, the mayor of Hannah, a Christian and a well-educated man, if we could borrow him as a Muslim for one night. He laughed heartily. 2 days before the mosque was to open, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who, as we know, is one of the most famous translators of the Quran into English, so Abdullah Yusuf Ali came at government expense to lecture at the University of Alberta. I was sent to the hotel where he was staying with our secretary, Muhammad Asif, to invite him to open the mosque, and he welcomed the chance to open the only mosque in North America. We asked him if the government would allow him to do so, and he said that no power on earth would stop him from doing this. And so the first mosque in Canada, the Al Rashid Mosque, had the famous translator Abdullah Yusuf Ali preside at its launch. That's the end of the story that I want to read from Hillary Hamden. Now here's the quiz part of the evening. I shared with you 4 stories. The man who came to be known as Alexander Hamilton, Salim Ghanam, Usman Ali, and Hillary Hamden. I read longer and shorter parts of their autobiographies, and obviously in something like that long, there are many themes that are mentioned. But I want to share with you the reason I chose each of these stories tonight to share with you. The first story of Alexander Hamilton, as he was known, is the story of the successful businessman, the entrepreneur, the resourceful person, the hardworking person. And I'm sure if I asked you to think about it, you could think about people that you know in your lives or that you've heard of here in Toronto or wherever you're living, of a successful businessman or a businesswoman or an entrepreneur or someone who comes and they work very, very hard. They build a life for themselves and support their family and they help their community. This is a success story of Muslims in Canada from the early 1900s. Then the story of Salim Ghanam. The reason I chose his story was because of his narrative of facing discrimination from a teacher in school. We know that our children are still facing discrimination in the schools, even from teachers. Just recently, there was a professor of, I think it's the University of Montana, who has had to step down from his post, I think it was yesterday, because he said that Muslims, if they're peaceful, they're not very Muslim, something along those lines. This means that Muslims have been facing discrimination from the earliest of days, and yet he handled it well, he overcame it, he researched and studied his faith, he became convinced in it, and he went on to make positive contributions to his community. He helped build organizations and mosques, and to make positive contributions to the society around him. And I'm sure you yourself have maybe experienced discrimination, or you know someone who has, and we have learnt to handle it. It's definitely a stress upon us, a mental health stress. We have many of our youngsters who some of them feel ashamed to identify as Muslims, or maybe they're not sure if they can be Muslim and Canadian. But we know that people are overcoming this, remaining committed to their faith, and in spite of all, remaining committed to being Canadian. So it's a love for Canada in spite of those black spots. And that was the story of Salim Ghanam that I wanted to point out. The next story of Usman Ali, who again has, many themes in his narrative, but the one that I wanted to highlight, it might have made you feel uncomfortable, is about the fights that happened between Muslims as they try to build their organizations. I'm sure all of you have been part of some mosque community where there have been fights and divisions and splits. And this is a part of our history, and I don't think we should shy away from it. It's not necessarily that we can learn never to repeat these things, because, as a famous historian once said, history teaches that history doesn't teach. But the lessons that we should take from it are that we need to learn how to manage diversity. There are differences amongst us. We have ethnic differences, customary differences. We have differences of Islamic law and interpretation, and the challenge of growth. The earlier communities found it easier to be together. And as growth happens, there's the challenge of managing growth. So we need to ponder this, to discuss it, to think about it, and build ourselves tools on how to manage diversity so that we can keep good brotherly and sisterly relations with each other, even if we feel a need to separate because of differences of opinion based on principle. So even though it might have made you feel uncomfortable, it is part of our current life, and it's also been part of our history of being Muslim in Canada, and that's why I shared the story of Usman Ali. And finally, the story of Hillary Hamden. There are two themes in her long narrative that I thought were especially useful and relevant for today. The first one is, of course, of the loneliness of a Muslim woman in a city quite isolated. Now, most of us don't live that isolated, but many women, especially the refugees who come here or the immigrants who don't speak English, get involved with the childcare in the house and get very lonely. They're very isolated. So this is a story that is part of the women's experience, Muslim women's experience of Canada, and it's something that we should also know about and think about and try to develop strategies to help alleviate. And the second reason why I wanted to share her story is she was a driving force in building that first mosque. She was the one who persuaded the mayor to give the free land, to get the speaker, to help get Abdullah Yusuf Ali. She travelled all over Alberta and Saskatchewan raising money. Women's role in mosque building is often overlooked. Quite often the men might be on the board, and the women are in the background. They organise the fundraising dinners, they clean the mosque, they clean the kitchen, they cook, they organise, they print and sell the tickets, they organise the dinners. If it wasn't for them, the mosques wouldn't exist either. So, as the Quran says, the believing men and women are helpers and protectors of one another. And unfortunately, because they don't often take centre or front stage, the very vital role of women in helping build and sustain the communities has been overlooked. And so that's why I wanted to share with you the story of Hillary Hamden. So, to sum up, we know that our human psyche needs to know what its roots are. We need to feel rooted in a place that we belong. And this has been known to Islamic scholars for a very long time. when they were developing what became known as the Maqasid al-Sharia, the principles or the aims or ends of Islamic law, Sharia. One of the 5 essentials was called asl, or lineage. So the right to life, the right to religion, the right to property, the right to mental well-being, and the right to lineage. Because the scholars know that it's important for a human being to know who their ancestors are. It helps with creating self-esteem and a solid sense of who you are, knowing who you are based on where you came from. So tonight I shared with you 4 stories, I think they're probably not very well known, of pioneers who have lived what we lived: entrepreneurship, discrimination, discord, loneliness, organizing and contributing to a cause. This gives us pride in what they achieved, guidance through how they struggled, and hope that we can achieve similar and maybe even better things. Thank you very much. Everything good I said is from Allah, and anything bad from me and the shaitan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That's okay. Thank you so much. Jazakallahu khairan, Professor Dr. Catherine Bullock. Alhamdulillah. Inshallah, I'm just checking on the chat if there are any questions. I really hope you guys had a really thought-provoking and enlightened discussion today, or at least news today. Alhamdulillah, I definitely learned a lot. Like, I didn't know the translator, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, was there for the grand opening of Al-Rashad Masjid in Edmonton. So that's new to me, but subhanAllah, like, you learn so much. But more so, aside from that tidbit, you can see the impact of Muslims in Canada. And of course, the 45 minutes that we have today did not do any justice to this. We did this in a course over 10 weeks, and even then that wasn't plenty enough. But alhamdulillah, you can see that, alhamdulillah, the saying that says we can be Muslims and we can be Canadian. So therefore, we can be both. You don't have to just be Canadian, and that means you're not Muslim, and you don't have to say I'm Muslim and I'm not Canadian. The two can definitely coexist, and they have been coexisting, as you can see back from the day from maybe even the Hudson's Bay fur traders and so forth. So again, I want to thank you again, Dr. Kathy, for coming, taking time, and most of all, thank you for attending online. Inshallah, one day we'll be back to live attendance and maybe more interactive. I know you're shy to ask any questions, but in the future, if you do, we'll definitely get you the answers. I do want to remind everyone, as I said in the opening, alhamdulillah and mashallah, Sound Vision has opened up Muslim Network Television. It's a wonderful, wonderful achievement and a really important thing for us to understand. In fact, if you recall, we had the pleasure of having Imam Abdul Mujahid a month ago in August, inshallah, 2 months ago, when he was visiting here, and he was talking about how many news stories were first broke from Muslim Network TV before even mainstream TV had it. So they're bringing all kinds of information, not just news about Muslims, but news, whatever is happening when the indigenous stories were happening, and they continue to happen. They're on top of it. Just the other day, prominent figures that are passed away in the United States, they're mentioning about it, of course, about the Afghanistan refugees, and all topics, the election that just recently happened, the federal election, what's going on with COVID and so forth. So please, Muslim Network TV, they're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, whatever channel you want to find them, follow them, inshallah, and tune in. And she will be your host, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that, and we'll look forward to an opportunity to have you here again, inshallah. Thank you again. Jazakallah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This ends our program, inshallah. Join us next week. We have Imam Abdul Hai Patel, who served as the Human Rights Commissioner for Canada, and we have our Imam Dr. Hamid Slimi, and I will wrap up Islamic History Month next week, inshallah. But don't forget, this Sunday is our annual Mawlid program from 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. You can either join us live here, you have to register, or you can come and join us live from online at YouTube. Take care, and we'll see you next Friday, inshallah, or we'll see you Sunday at 2 p.m., inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. If we can make the adhan, inshallah, Hafiz Ra'id, inshallah.